Hello and welcome to lecture 3. You'll remember in lecture 2, we considered and examined international trade focusing on just a single product. It was motorbikes is what we discussed. For full analysis, however, of international trade, it requires us to consider the entire economy, which gets very complex very quickly. Fortunately, we can gain additional insight by considering an economy composed of just two products. So we're going to move from a one product economy, as in lecture 2, and move it to a two product economy in lecture 3. So we've gotten just slightly more complex, and we'll be able to discuss some new theory. Well, it's old, but we'll be presenting it here. And we'll be discussing why everybody trades. And it has to do with what we call comparative advantage. So let's jump in. Okay, so the first thing we'll be discussing is Adam Smith's theory of absolute advantage. Adam Smith lived during the 1700s. He was a Scottish economist and is considered to be the father of modern economics, or he's also been called the father of capitalism. So in his book, Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith promoted free trade by comparing nations to households. Every household finds it worthwhile to produce only some of the products it consumes and to buy other products using the proceeds from what the household can sell to others. The same should apply to nations. Adam Smith was so famous that I went to his gravesite. I did my master's degree in Edinburgh, Scotland, and went back to visit many times because of good friends there. So here I am at the cemetery where Adam Smith was buried, there in Edinburgh, Scotland. So let's talk about the principle of absolute advantage. A country is expected to export those goods in which it has an absolute cost advantage, according to Adam Smith, and import goods in which it has an absolute cost disadvantage. So let's start by looking at this table down below. We're going to start on the second half, labor hours to make. So we're going to be comparing the United States with the rest of the world. And so let's first look at cloth. 1 unit of cloth. How many labor hours does it take the United States to make 1 unit of cloth? Well, in this example, we're showing that it's 4 hours to make 1 unit of cloth. If we look at the rest of the world, it only takes them 1 hour to make 1 unit of cloth. And so you can see already it takes the US more time. Now we can look at it in a different way, units of cloth per labor hour. Well, it takes 4 labor hours for 1 unit of cloth, so the US will only produce 1/4 of 1 unit of cloth per labor hour, whereas the world can produce 1 entire unit of cloth per labor hour. Then we're going to look at the second product that is being considered, 1 unit of wheat. Here, the US has an advantage. It only takes the US 2 hours of labor hours to produce 1 unit of wheat. Whereas in the rest of the world, it takes them 2.5 hours to produce 1 unit of wheat. So in this example, we've got the United States with an absolute cost disadvantage in producing cloth. It takes them 4 hours, whereas the rest of the world takes 1 hour. However, when we consider wheat, the United States has an absolute cost advantage when compared to the rest of the world. Following on from Adam Smith's theory of absolute advantage is David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. David Ricardo was an English economist, and he lived, he was a bit younger, came at the end of the 1700s. And his theory was that mutually beneficial trade can occur even when one nation, say the rest of the world, is absolutely better at producing all goods. So in this example, we're looking at the rest of the world is absolutely better at producing all goods when compared to the United States. Although the rest of the world is absolutely better, the key is relative prices or relative costs and not absolute prices or costs of products. So in other words, it is the opportunity cost of producing each product in each country that will determine the basis for trade among nations. So one nation may have such an advantage in producing a product that it would be better for them to produce that product as opposed to another product that they also have an absolute advantage in, because they have limited inputs, limited labor, limited materials. So there's an opportunity cost and they have to pick which one to produce. So they will pick, and other countries will pick what they would produce. So this gives us relative prices, not absolute prices of products, and where one country will have a comparative advantage over another. So Ricardo's theory of trade, looking at comparative advantage, a country will export products that it can produce at a low opportunity cost in terms of other goods that could be produced within the country. So low opportunity cost. A country will import products that it would otherwise produce at a high opportunity cost. So again, we're looking at relative or comparative advantages. Ricardo focused on labor productivity or resource productivity more generally for different products in different countries. So the basis for trade is relative differences in labor or resource productivity. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, the basis for trade is a relative advantage in a particular product. So let's go back. We've changed the assumptions here a little bit with the rest of the world. The United States is still the same. They're just as productive as they've always been. To make 1 unit of cloth, it takes the US 4 hours. To produce 1 unit of wheat, it takes 2 hours. Now with the rest of the world, you can see they have an absolute advantage in both products now. It takes them 1 hour to create 1 unit of cloth and 1.5 hours to produce 1 unit of wheat. And so in this case, you might assume, well, the US should just import everything from the rest of the world. That's not always the case. And we're going to look at relative advantage or comparative advantage from this point of view of David Ricardo. So here we've got in the United States with no international trade. So we're going to assume at this point there's no international trade. And within the borders of the US, they're producing all their cloth and all their wheat needs. So we can look at it, we can compare the price of cloth, or at least price cloth, in terms of wheat. So it's 2 wheat per cloth. And the way we get that math is 4 divided by 2. So it takes 4 hours to make cloth, and it takes 2 hours to produce wheat. So, so the price of cloth is 2 wheat per cloth, and the price of wheat is half a cloth for every wheat. So this is the way we produce it. So half a cloth for every wheat. Now let's look at the rest of the world. It's 0.7 wheat per cloth. So you can see they've got an advantage there, but it's 1.5 cloth per wheat. So you can see here, there is a comparative advantage for the US in the production of wheat. It only takes the US half a unit of cloth to produce the wheat, whereas it takes the rest of the world 1.5 units of cloth to produce wheat. And so in that case, traders would look at cloth as the common denominator, and then they could trade in wheat, giving the United States a comparative advantage in wheat. And so the US would still import cloth, but they would export wheat for the rest of the world. Hence, the US has a comparative advantage in the production of wheat and a comparative disadvantage in the production of cloth. The rest of the world has a comparative advantage in the production of cloth and a comparative disadvantage in the production of wheat. So with free trade, the US will export wheat and import cloth. So Ricardo's constant costs and the production possibility curve is another concept we need to review. The production possibility curve, or PPC, it shows all combinations of amounts of different products that an economy can produce with full employment of its resources and maximum feasible productivity of the resources. So Ricardo's constant costs on the effects of trade. With no trade, each nation's choices for the consumption of wheat and cloth is limited to a point along its production possibility curve. But with free trade between the two countries, each country specializes at point S1, which we'll look at here in a second, in producing its comparative advantage product. With free trade, consumers in each country can consume at any point along the new trade line, for example, at point C, and enjoy a higher standard of living. So let's take a look at these. Now let's look at the production possibility curves for both the United States and the rest of the world. So here we've got this dark line. This is all of the production possibility that the United States has. So we're going to assume that the US has 100 hours, 100 labor hours, which it can allocate between producing either wheat or cloth. And you remember they are able to produce half a unit of wheat per hour. So with 100 hours, if the US just focused 100% on wheat, they would be able to produce 50 units, 50 billion units per year. Now, you can see on the other side, if the US, which it takes 4 hours to produce cloth, they'll only produce 25 as opposed to the 50 wheat. So, and they can, as we go down this line, this production possibility curve, we're now producing less wheat and producing more cloth. So here, this is what the US could produce on its own, and everything below that they could produce within this as well, if they're not as productive as they could be. The same is with the rest of the world. So here, with their 100 billion hours that they can allocate, they can either produce 67 billion units of wheat or 100 billion units of cloth. So when trade is opened up between the United States and the rest of the world, what will happen is the US will produce at this S1, this point S1, they're going to produce wheat because that's what they have a comparative advantage in. And the rest of the world will produce cloth, which will give them their comparative advantage. And what we end up seeing because of trade, the US will be able to trade along the trade line, and the rest of the world will be able to trade along the trade line, which makes both the United States and the rest of the world better off, even though the rest of the world had an absolute advantage at both production of products, and the US had a disadvantage in both. But because of comparative advantage and the relative price differences between these materials or things that they're producing, the US and the rest of the world can benefit because of this trade. So the question is, does it make sense for a country to pursue a policy of self-sufficiency, for example, in food or energy? why or why not. According to these two theories, self-sufficiency is counterproductive, that the world is better off, that the nations that trade together are better off, all things being equal, if they pursue a policy of free trade, international trade. So here are some implications of the theory of comparative advantage. According to the Ricardian model, relative price differences arise from productivity differences that are in turn due to exogenous differences in technology among nations. The word exogenous just means that it affected one nation and not the other. And so they're not equally affected. So the productivity differences here are due to differences in technology among nations. For whatever reason, the US had a comparative advantage in producing wheat and a comparative disadvantage in producing cloth. So although comparative advantage determines the pattern of trade among nations, absolute advantage is important in determining the income in each country, and we'll go over that. So does absolute advantage matter? If free trade is so good, why do so many people fear it? Activists and protesters have recently been complaining loudly that trade has bad effects on workers in developing countries, workers in the industrialized countries, and the natural environment. So these are the arguments against free trade. So analysis of absolute advantage and comparative advantage focuses on a resource called labor. So let's focus on trade and workers. There are other considerations that governments have to take into account when they're looking at trade. And so, as mentioned before, we're looking at simple cases, but in analysis of absolute advantage and comparative advantage, we just focus on the resource called labor. So let's focus on trade and workers. A big part of the answer to these questions is that absolute advantage does matter, but it matters not for determining the trade pattern, but rather for determining national wage levels and national living standards. So wage levels and living standards are determined by absolute advantage. Workers can receive high wages and enjoy high living standards if they are highly productive. Workers with low productivity are paid low wages. And this scatter plot shows us the average wage relative to the United States versus the average labor productivity. This is the average labor productivity and average wage in manufacturing in 2006. So you can see the more productive, productivity is here along the bottom, the more productive, the higher the wage. So there is a relationship between productivity and wage. So when we're dealing with nations that are more productive in certain products should receive a higher wage for the production of those products. And so it really does matter. And as we look at some additional items in future chapters, you'll see how this can apply in the real world. With that, we'll end lecture on chapter 3. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm available in my office or during my office hours, either via email or phone. And you can also schedule an appointment if those times don't work for you. Thank you very much.